Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening. The racial justice team leadership has been working on a series of learning opportunities through the end of winter and beginning of spring. Today, Reverend Dr. Nancy Ramsey will lead us in ways that the church has been complicit in anti-racism. Looking forward to that. On February 6th at 7 o'clock, we'll welcome Dr. Erskine Clark, who's going to discuss how churches also were complicit in the formation of racism in our culture. In March, we'll talk with Carolyn Crowder, who created a film At the River, and some of you, I think, may have seen that already. And we'll view that, I believe, and then we'll have some time with her to discuss. We're not sure about the date and time of that quite yet, but be on the lookout for that. And in April, we're hoping that Beloved will join with us, and they're planning a time for us to learn about asset mapping and ways that we can use assets in our community, in our church, and identify those or resources that we can use in advocating for social justice for BIPOC people. We also want to offer an evening where we will talk about Native American, the issues of Native Americans and our history here in Western North Carolina, possibly, but definitely how the church was complicit in the removal of Native Americans from their tribal lands. And with that, I guess we'll get started with Reverend Dr. Nancy Ramsey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. And I'm delighted to have all of you here on this Zoom and for the opportunity to talk with you a bit about the Doctrine of Discovery and the ways in which it tells the story of the origins and the legacy ongoing of racism, beginning in Europe and certainly coming to the shores of the United States. I'm going to be posting the resources that I cite tonight on the First Presbyterian Church website in the Racial Justice Team page. So let me just begin by jumping right in. And given our goal for this evening with it, and with the encouragement of our denomination, always to begin by acknowledging whose land this rightfully is, I want to begin by confessing that I speak from land stolen from the Cherokee people and other smaller tribes. In other words, tonight we are not talking about a sin of which we know nothing. I want to offer a brief description of the goals for this series across the spring. It relates to elaborating on the unanimous decision of the session in the spring of 2020, or the fall rather, 2020, to explore and better understand historically the emergence of the concept of race and the practice of racism, to better understand how racism originated and what has helped it have such enduring power, to better understand how we who have learned to imagine we are white participate in the continuing power of racism in our church and culture, and to become more effective in interrupting the destructive power of racism. The definition of white racism that informs our congregational Matthew 25 commitment is well offered by a scholar named Derek Bell, Jr. He describes it as an interlocking system of advantage based on race. And I want to underscore the terms interlocking and advantage. In other words, he's refuting the national myth of meritocracy. This definition refutes the idea that Americans live on a level playing field and each person has the same opportunity to succeed on their own merit. Matthew 25 congregations are committed to learning to recognize and deconstruct that race-based system of advantage. Many of us who identify as white likely grew up imagining racism as a system of disadvantage, with no clarity about our role in it or the origins of those disadvantages. Somehow racism just emerged, and its cause and its persistence remained inexplicable. How we define a problem, of course, has everything to do with how effectively we're able to engage it. What has shifted for many of us, especially since the spring and summer of 2020, with the very public violence against Black citizens, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, is the recognition of the linkage between racism and the privileges of whiteness. This spring series will help us recognize the systemic scope of racism in our churches and culture, and give us tools for being part of the change we want to see and be. The challenge, of course, is choosing to face and repudiate and disassemble such privileges that go back to the very inception of the idea of slavery. Black persons as property, after all, is in the constitutional DNA of our country and the war which nearly tore us apart in the mid-19th century. The most helpful question that I've been asked in the process of unmasking white privilege is, how did I learn to be white? I hope tonight is of some use in your reflection on that question. And thinking theologically, what ways do I tell myself the lie that I cannot do otherwise than choose or accept the advantages of whiteness? If you identify as another race in this culture watching this video tonight, it's likely you are very conscious of how you were taught to inhabit that identity, that marginalized identity, and how important it was to know the rules of it for your own safety. Now let's turn particularly to the focus tonight, the doctrine of discovery and its legacy. I want to begin with two sentences from Ta-Nehisi Coates in his acclaimed book, Between the World and Me. Coates writes on page 7, race is the child of racism, not the father. The process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy, so much as one of hierarchy. We'll come back to that with theologians describing this as sin as lie. He also uses the phrase that some people believe they are white. That is, race as a construction, far more political, vastly far more political than the tiny percentage of our DNA that is biological. He makes two important points here, especially for us as Christians, as we engage the origins of the idea of race and the practice of racism. They require that we explore the context in which the practice of racism and the idea of race emerge, because they fuel the rationalizations that shape what historians now call the doctrine of discovery. Before we get to that, though, one more preface. Let's bring a theological frame to the historical emergence of colonization and the practice of racism and the new idea of race. Factually, it's crucial to remind us, all of us, that the physiological fact of skin color, what we learn to identify as race, is an insignificant portion of our DNA. It is in no way an essential feature of being human. For centuries, it was unimportant, partly because persons were often with those who looked like them. What we know about sin helps us imagine that this feature of human beings proved useful when some humans imagined the possibility of asserting superiority for gaining power and wealth. Coates is correct when he suggests that race, then, is the child of racism, invented for the practice of oppressing others to gain some advantage for which skin color became convenient. Before we focus in on the doctrine of discovery and its sequels, I want to offer two theological resources that may be of use for us on this journey. In the 20th century, several white theologians, Reinhold Niebuhr, Marjorie Suchocki, and Wendy Farley, who began at different points, nonetheless came to a shared definition of sin that is helpful in wrestling with racism. They spoke of sin as lie, the lie of telling ourselves that we were not free to act differently, for example, to resist racism. Fumitaka Matsuoka, a Japanese-American theologian, wrote that the sin of racism lies in its negation of our inherent relation one to the other as children of God. His insight evokes for me the powerful parable often called the Good Samaritan, in which for his Jewish audience, Jesus chose a despised other, the Samaritan, to be the model of the love God calls us to embody in relation to one another. With those theological anchors, let's turn back to the 15th century origins of what will later be described as the Doctrine of Discovery. The region of the world we now call Europe is where this all began. The prevailing skin color was some version of what we learned to call white. Mediterranean folk probably had then, as now, often a more olive skin tone, but nonetheless all thought of themselves as white, though they didn't use that term. There wasn't, of course, no unified European identity, no shared reflection on the fact of varied skin color to the extent some had seen such, but there was a cultural aversion to Black, as if it referenced something evil. That might be relevant in a bit. Christianity prevailed and was Catholic in governance. The Pope was singularly powerful. Slavery as an economic fact existed widely, but with no relation to any notion of skin color or different degree of humanity. In the 14th century, crusades against the Muslims, the critical difference was religion and not their darker skin. The origins of the Doctrine of Discovery then arise post the Crusades from the 11th through the 13th century, and they gave rise to the inception of worldwide papal authority, that is, the Crusades did. And by the 13th century, the papacy presumed its authority to deny pagan peoples of their self-governance and property. Imagine the sweeping assumption of authority that was. Based on Jesus' instruction to Peter, the Pope assumed this authority by the words, "Feed my sheep." That is, the papacy presumed that it was given jurisdiction over infidels and Christians everywhere, though infidels, of course, likely did not recognize such power. The Pope was invested with responsibility for realizing the universal Christian commonwealth. Pope Innocent IV declared that it was legal for Christians to occupy invaded territory because such territory reverted to the church whom the Pope represented. The Pope assumed responsibility and power to justify holy wars such as the Crusades, which intended to reconquer lands belonging to Christians. So we get a sense of the enormous power and influence that the church could presume and was uncontested. But there's something else often not mentioned, which was happening around this time as well, and that is the emergence of economic powers, especially in Southern Europe, in Spain and Portugal, and their early imaginations of what we would now know as capitalism, the opportunity to gain great wealth. Especially in Spain and Portugal, some men had begun to imagine the possibility of wealth, and they began to imagine the early descriptions of the New World as inviting the opportunity to exploit people and land to gain that wealth. But the challenge then, as now, is where to find affordable labor, in their case, probably cheap labor, to explore the wealth that could be found there. Here, Ta-Nehisi Coates' insight comes back to the fore. Race was the child of racism. a justification for conquering the pagans whose skin color became the pretense for otherness. Listen to how subsequent papal actions developed this concept of otherness. By the 15th century, the door was open to Spanish and then Portuguese ambitions to colonize Africa and the New World, with the right to seize the lands and rights of non-Christians. Throughout the first half of the 15th century, papal bulls furthered the ambitions of Spain and Portugal, giving them guardianship over indigenous people, protecting them from others and converting them to Christianity. And if they showed inadequate grasp of natural laws to guide their behavior, that is, those indigenous people, then the Pope could invoke his Petrine guardianship to care for God's flock. Spain and Portugal repeatedly sought and received greater and greater portions of the still unexplored New World. In 1455 came what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. Well, really what we should call the earliest version of it. Listen to its reach. Pope Nicholas V granted Portugal title to the lands of indigenous peoples in Africa that Portugal had acquired, an interesting and careful word choice, and shall hereafter come to be acquired, authorizing Portugal to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue Saracens, that would be Muslims, and pagans, that would be the Africans, and place them into perpetual slavery and to seize all their property. Note that the term pagans would later complicate enslaving Africans who converted to Christianity. At the height of influence at the end of the 15th century, the Church, Spain, and Portugal asserted the doctrine stood for these four things: the authority of the Church to grant Christian kings title and sovereignty over indigenous peoples and their lands everywhere. European exploration, conquest, and colonization served to help the papacy exercise guardianship over all peoples. Portugal and Spain held exclusive rights over other European countries to colonize the New World. Simply, the discovery of lands by these two countries gave them ownership rights. Christian then also meant white, and those enslaved were Black, with many native Indians colonized or enslaved. But by the 16th century, things were beginning to change. First, among Catholic scholars, who wrote that Christian rights to the acquisitions of lands needed to include respect for Indian, that would be native peoples in Latin and South America, and the Caribbean, to retain some autonomous powers and entitlements. But the big change also included the Reformation in England, because Queen Victoria desacralized the prior language about discovery, and Protestant England then set its sights on North America, using the doctrine of discovery for its own purposes, to claim lands not yet claimed for economic gain of the British Empire. In the late 19th century in the United States, the US court system invoked a thoroughly secularized doctrine of discovery as legal justification for seizing the lands of Native Americans for the interest of European Americans. So the European origins of the doctrine of discovery do not exhaust the use of the doctrine by the British, whose own story of conquest is much more decisive for the American story. But you don't find that British story so much in the document that our staff at the PCUSA prepared. It is really following the Catholic Church beginnings of the doctrine and then its invocation in the United States. The British story is one that helps us understand how they invoke the doctrine of discovery, and their practice of colonizing made whiteness more prominent, as their intention was to claim and take over land the British sorely needed because their island nation was growing more crowded. Now, in the 17th century, international power and wealth were sufficient rationale to capture and exploit the land and native peoples living in North America, where Portugal and Spain were not active. The British had already, and really at the same time with their initial explorations in what we call the American colonies, they were at the same time engaged in brutally conquering the Irish race. Notice they called the Irish they called them a race, because the Catholicism of the Irish made them dangerously linked to the ambitions of the Portuguese and the Spanish. Now, the British sometimes invoked Christian purposes, colonizing and conquering and killing native peoples. The doctrine of discovery was useful legally and economically in their drive for establishing their empire in the New World. Progress for the white British was deadly for Native Americans and for the Black slaves who were brought to the South, especially to make farming profitable there. One window into the British imagination about Native peoples is evident in the character of Caliban found in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. I don't know how many of you on this video tonight or this Zoom are English majors in days past, but somehow I can assure you that this was never noted when I took Shakespeare. Whiteness was the standard for land ownership. And as we know, in the South, where slavery was economically useful, it was commonplace and brutal. Whiteness became the primary means for owning land, participation in self-governance, and access to gaining wealth. And as the country evolved, whiteness involved more than white skin. If their skin color might pass for white, Eastern Europeans and Mediterranean populations, as well as those of Asian descent, still had to become white by forgetting their native languages and changing their names. Even now, a review of the criteria for identifying as white varies every decade in the United States Census, as it did as recently as 2020. What white means is pliable, but clearly remains very important. The doctrine of discovery underscores for US citizens, especially those of us who identify as Christians and imagine we are white, that ours is a complicated and ethically fraught heritage. And it points toward what the continuing story of coloniality will be as it impacts Native peoples in the Americas and the United States particularly, and as it continues to affect those whose enslavement it justified. Now, this is clearly a quick review of the doctrine of discovery, but I wanted to go through it in hopes that we might be able to have conversation tonight that allowed all of us to have a chance to comment on this and talk with each other about this idea of the doctrine of discovery, which might be new to some of you and not to others. So if you have questions of clarification or such as that for me, I'm glad to start there. But then I hope that we can talk with each other about the implications of this tragic story that has such continuing life. If we think even right now, for example, of the reclaiming of some of the traditional Native American sites that President Biden ordered, and that Deb Haaland, who has the first Native American Secretary of the Interior, has celebrated. But let's start with the doctrine of discovery. What might be new here, or what implications do you see for our journey with racism now in the United States?
Nancy.
Yes. Hey, Tom.
Thank you for this, and it brings up reminders of recent study I have done of the the journeys of and discoveries of Christopher Columbus and his, of course, mandate, I guess you would say, of the Doctrine of Discovery, and unfortunately the way that he, at least from the reports that I've read, certainly took advantage of that in a very negative way, and enslaved and brutalized many of the natives that he came across.
Exactly.
And I think it was recognized that he was doing the wrong thing at a certain point by his sponsors, and they sent others to rectify that, but actually it ended up continuing. So I think it's, to me, that was a very graphic understanding of what was a very early, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't the earliest, but it was a very early example of that. And I think it's hard. It's so hard because when we create a hero of someone like Christopher Columbus, and name so many things for him, and it's hard for us to backtrack from that and to recognize our complicity in maintaining that same mentality, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I find that notion of sin is lie, that we couldn't have done otherwise, a very powerful way of imagining what sin is. And the generations, the centuries that has functioned, at least for Christians, related to racism, the practice of racism. And of course, the invention of whiteness to justify slavery and conquest. It's a powerful story.
Closed captioning brought to you by Master. We proudly help veterans with missile fulfillment.
Let me ask this: when you think about this, the emergence of the implications of the doctrine of discovery, as we as a congregation and as others on this Zoom that are in other Presbyterian congregations in our presbytery and beyond, what are the implications that rise for you in terms of your own personal and congregational commitments to address racism? What are the implications when you know that there are these centuries in which our faith has been entangled in the fact and practice of racism, its origin, and also in later centuries in resisting it?
It's mind-boggling to me that this is the year 2022, and from the 1300s, this has been the case. And speaking from my own point of view, have been ignorant for all but the last 2 or 3 years of my life of the depth of this this history and of our implication as so-called white people.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would amen that, Babby.
deep, and they still push through the smoke.
Nancy,
Mhm.
this is Heath Rader speaking.
Right, I see you.
For me, the implications tend to almost be overwhelming because I continually am finding myself recognizing how, because of this, how deeply rooted it is in everything about our church. Since you were mentioning it too, how we see it in our churches, it's so much a part of the identity of who we have been that tearing it apart and breaking it, it seems at times almost impossible because we're not even sure what we're tearing apart. It's so much a part of who we are. It's just inherent in our identity. And for somebody as old as I am, it's really painful to think that I have thought that I've spent a good deal of my life trying to overcome systems of racism and experiences where I've been, and yet, good night, I haven't done a thing. I mean, it just, and you feel like, so I think one part of it for me is how we equip, for an older person, how do we equip our younger people to understand how critical it is we give up what we've loved because we are realizing what we've loved isn't lovable. And how do we integrate into it what is the truth about love and acceptance? Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And I guess one of the things I would want to offer is, what I've focused on is the implications of the doctrine of discovery.
Yes.
And its influence. But I haven't meant to convey, I was simply focusing there. We could go back into the history in Europe, but also especially in Britain. But we can also look in our own country and see resistance by people of faith. So there's a story to claim there and try to amplify. It's not the singular story about the church. I think it shows the vulnerability of institutions like the church, for sure, and the need to be always attentive to the ways that we're lured into the possibilities of our own well-being at the expense of others, and that's part of why I'm paying attention to that insight in 20th century and early into the 21st century about sin as lie, that we couldn't have done otherwise. And the importance, it seems to me, Heath, of holding that up and beginning to think, what does that mean for us now? How do we go to the city council? How do we go to the board of commissioners of our county? How do we testify regarding Native American rights where we live and beyond? So I guess it's daunting, but I hope in time that it becomes a challenge, but not silencing.
Well, maybe I was more fatalistic than I meant to be. I guess part of that really does have to do with age and thinking how much more time do I have to stand up for these things. But indeed, what we're seeing, I'm not sure who was speaking a moment ago about it's been the last 2 or 3 years when enlightenment has come. Boy, we're just seeing this left and right, and that's extraordinary, and that is wonderful and a good thing. So I appreciate you saying that, and I certainly accept that.
I think both of us think of that, Heath, just to be clear, as not wiping out the harm, but not letting it be encompassing. And it's not the whole story, certainly about Christian witness. And that's part of why both when Dr. Clark presents and then later when we see this film about resistance to racism by religious leaders in the South during the civil rights, we're reminded that our choices can make a difference, even in the face of a cultural-wide lie about some of those whom God invites us to know as neighbors. How about others of you? What have you heard tonight that sparks your imagination or your energies about resisting racism, picking up this mantle of the Matthew 25 commitment that First Presbyterian in Asheville and many, many other congregations in our denomination have embraced?
Well, in worship today, we did Epiphany. And so the whole idea of light has been kind of reverberating in me recently. And I love that idea of sin as light.
No, I said
as Lee is a lie, sin is a lie.
right, sin is lie, yeah.
Yes, sin is a lie. And how I really feel like over my life, I can see these pinpricks of light coming into that light, that darkness.
Yeah.
And being able to recognize, like I remember the first time I was in a small group with a Black woman, and she was trying to describe microaggressions to me. And I was just, I couldn't it was just so hard to get my very white privileged brain around what do you even mean by this microaggression thing? And just steadily over the years, just more and more light getting into it for me personally. And then how do I then reflect that more into my life and help others as well? It's I love that sin as lie. That's a great way to look at that.
Yeah. David.
Well, one of the things I really appreciate what you've shared and the conversation. I think, like Heath, find that the more that I learn, the more overwhelming it can be. I know there's a lot of work being done at the denominational level to look back historically and kind of take some ownership over where we've been complicit. I guess one of the curiosities bubbling up for me is wondering if that's been done at our congregation level of looking back and saying here in the history of our church. And as a new person, that's just something that
right.
I'm curious about that anyway, but I wonder if that would be that sometimes on the small scale, it helps to look at and see here's where we can make little reparations.
That is a plan. That is one of the presentations that we have planned for the spring. This spring might go into June, who knows, but there's plenty to cover. But that is, we do have a history. It doesn't come up to the present, but it is important to name. Obviously, there are going to be some hard things to recognize that we need to own. And I also am aware of churches in the denomination who have also been doing that. And then, in the outcome of that coming together and talking together, then engaging in liturgical practices such as a service of lament that acknowledges what we have done and also claims the promise that we can go forward differently. So we definitely plan to include, beginning at least with a written history of the congregation and drawing on some of our members to help us go beyond those years. And I'm glad you mentioned that because we need to make sure that's named as part of the series that we've planned.
Nancy?
Yes.
Earl Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
What can we learn from some of the other denominations? I'm thinking about Quakers and also the Moravians in the Mediterranean. I mean the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm. you want to say more, Earl, about what we know about the witness of the Quakers, that's for sure, or many of us do, as courageous and anti-racism, and starting, even before certainly the Civil War. But were there particular things that, I don't know about the Caribbean, but it sounds like you're better versed in this. Are there particular lessons you think we should learn?
I don't know that much about the Moravians, except that they were very compassionate to people in the Caribbean in ways of help and support. And
Uh-huh.
The biggest selection of the most pretty tricks on thekiwiautogroup.com.
I guess how about there are others of you that know more about the Christian groups that have offered a more consistent historical witness against racism that you'd like to speak to?
A number of Americans quitting their job is higher than ever.
Do the data tell you why?
We can see what sectors people are quitting: retail sectors and hospitality.
Okay, I'm going to just speak up. Somebody is not muted and they have a TV on in the background. So if you people can kind of check and see if you're muted, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
What's likely to look like in the near future? That's our story tonight.
Jay.
Yeah, I'm from Unity Presbyterian in Denver, North Carolina, and a member of the Compassion, Peace, and Justice team there. So over the last several years, we've been trying to prepare ourselves and made a declaration to be a Matthew 25 church. But in approaching anti-racism, we have a mixed bag of people, and many people have grown up in this area, and this is what their life is what they have experienced and what they were taught, and they don't see some of the things that others see. And we decided to take an extended period, year or two, to try to get the various prejudices that people in everywhere, but we're focused on our congregation. Let's sort of clean up the house before we go out and engage in overt anti-racist kinds of campaigns or activities and so forth, and face backlash, resistance, and it could be counterproductive. And the way that we chose to do this was to zero in on, other people, an awareness of how we may be not intentionally, but unintentionally treating those people who are different from us in ways that, are not in accord with the teachings of Jesus, for example. So, and the premise is that we all have prejudices, every one of us, and many times, many of them, we're not even aware that we have them. So we want to open the dialogue and kind of focus on that and address that. And what we've done is produce a series of videos that focus on how other people live, and we try to walk in their shoes. And the video series is entitled "Walking in the Shoes of Others," and we've focused on interviewing several people who, for example, grew up in our community. I mean, Black people growing up Black in Denver. Another is we interviewed several Asians, so Asians in America these days. We have a whole series on, an extended interview focused on refugees and immigrants. And here we interviewed the head of one of the resettlement agencies, and we interviewed a number of immigrants who have successfully transitioned into becoming citizens, and even as citizens, the kinds of prejudice that they still kind of receive, you weren't born here, why don't you go back where you came from, that type of thing, hurtful kinds of things. And most recently, one on overcoming adversity, which is really focused on people with, who might have disabilities or other abled. And so it's not just watching the video, but then
Right.
having conversations about what we witnessed and felt and learned, and actually learning from each other. This takes time,
Right.
and it takes a kind of an open recognition that we all have prejudices of one sort or another. So we're all on an equal playing field at the start anyway. And hopefully, and I mean, so far, we're not going to be measuring, we're not going to be counting people, but we're looking for ways that these feelings change and people self-discover and admit that they do. They are willing to acknowledge that they have some attitudes that are not productive, that are not right, and begin to make small changes. And we expect to see that the result of that impacted in the policies that we pursue and the goals that we set within our church over the next several years.
Thank you, Jay. A process of broader recognition of forms of difference treated oppressively. Listening carefully, recognizing what the consequences of that oppression is. That's powerful.
Because if we look at the PCUSA definition of anti-racism, they strongly make the point that there's a distinction between racial prejudice and racism. So there is racism in our community that is systemic racism. But not everyone who has racial prejudice is a racist by this definition. So that making that distinction enables us to, move into anti-racism more smoothly and in a united way.
Nancy.
Yes, Jamie.
I've become a little interested in, and it's a hard subject, but dehumanization of people of color, and just how that got started. And when you were talking about, I'm sorry, I can't remember the gentleman's name, the Japanese.
Matsuoka Fumitaka.
Fumitaka, is that right? Yeah.
Matsuoka Fumitaka, right.
Just that kind of distortion of the relation to each other as children of God.
The negation of relation. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just writing down his name. I wanted to check that out.
He wrote a book, I'm not sure it's still in print, that it's called The Color of Faith. And he meant it to be a resource for anti-racism work in congregations. I'm trying to remember the Protestant denomination with which he identifies. He's a theologian and the former dean of a school on the West Coast, but I found his definition of the negation of relation well capturing the sin of racism.
Yeah.
And, one of the things, of course, that happens when we do that is that we're also negating our own identity.
Right.
We do damage to ourselves. I'm trying to remember the philosopher around World War II, a woman in Europe, who talked about the way racism can turn, that kind of sin turns our hearts to stone. And I think that's a tremendous insight. One of the songs that has been powerful, since the early 50s in the United States wasn't it Hammerstein? I always get Rodgers and Hammerstein, which of them was the lyricist, confused. But, You've Got to Be Taught. You've got to be carefully taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. I think there's a reason that the lyrics from now 50 years ago, more than 50, 70 years ago, have remained powerful in our culture. And that's why I encourage you all, I mentioned the assignment, which took half a day in my anti-racism training, for us to go off individually and reflect on how we learned to be white or whatever our race was. And I think that's part of what Hammerstein was trying to lift up, is that, we're not born racist. We learn to be racist. And so beginning to uncover how we learned it is a step toward rejecting it. And when it's an overwhelming influence in a culture, it would be no small thing to be able to resist it. But we're in points now in our lives where we're able to look back and think, and I think this is part of what's probably happening for some folks in Jay's congregation, not only about race, but other forms of treating difference oppressively. How did I learn that? How did I see it practiced? And how can I step out of that cycle and begin to reject it, be part of the rejection of it? To my mind, that's a big part of what it will mean for us as a congregation to really embrace this Matthew 25 commitment. Because nobody is born a racist. It's mighty hard to resist it in a culture that is overwhelmingly racist. But it is possible to step out of it. One of the things that the racial justice team has been doing, and we anticipate continuing, is to be in close conversation with other Black Christian leaders and other Black leaders in our city, to ask them to help us see where there are points that we could lend our energies with their guidance to resist forms of difference treated oppressively, to resist racism. And those conversations become very important in the process of change. So this is a strategy that we've tried now with 2 congregations, and strategies that we're using with members of the City Council and the County Board of Commissioners to indicate this is our concern. This is who we intend to be. Where can we lend our influence now, intentionally, to be a different kind of influence in this city? I hope that, does that ring bells for some of you in the ways that you're trying to engage in resisting? Maybe it's other kinds of forms of difference treated oppressively, or possibly your own story with resisting racism.
Nancy, I'd like to mention a tool that is available. Is somebody else raising their hand? I'm sorry.
Not that I can tell.
Oh, okay. A tool that it can help us with that is one of our Presbyterian-related seminaries, Auburn Seminary, out of New York. And yes, I'm advertising a board that I serve on, but Auburn, ceased years ago offering traditional seminary programs and have invested all of their money into making a difference in this world. And the focus, well, first of all, their sort of underlying theme is trouble the waters, heal the world. And so much of it is involving some of the most outstanding national leaders in our country. Black, white, Jews, I mean, on and on, Muslims, so many people, and they have fabulous resources. And so people who are looking for some tools to maybe assist in doing that might want to go online and look up Auburn Seminary. It's not Auburn University. This is in New York City. It's Auburn Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and it is related to our denomination. But that they are, I think, doing some extraordinary work. I'm in awe.
Thank you, Heath. And I'll be sure to write the president and tell her that you did your part as a board member tonight too. You know, the other thing that I want to mention that we're doing at First Pres, I bet at some of the other congregations that are represented in this Zoom, is paying attention to ways we as white citizens can raise our voices in city government and with the Board of Commissioners, for example, or at the state level, when there are issues raised, such as the decision thus far by the county commissioners not to fund pre-K education for all children in the city of Asheville. That's something that matters. And it's demonstrated in the drastically different levels of achievement or opportunity to achieve in our city. Now, that's an occasion where a white citizen's letter matters as much as anybody else's to say we're watching what you choose to do on this matter. And I know that there are a group of white clergy who plan to go and talk to the superintendent, who, when he came to the Asheville City Schools, indicated that he wanted to address the effects of racism that were evident in the Asheville City School results. But somehow he needs more support. That'd be my gentle way of saying that, you know, I know that there are a group of white clergy who intend to go and talk to him. So what I'm trying to say is it's not only when we can walk beside, but when we can be in conversation or attentive to even the information available to us with eyes that are looking to see where inequities exist, and to begin to think about how a more privileged location, simply by virtue of our race, might be a source of leverage to make a difference. So it's both the conversations we're having with historically Black congregations in our city right now, where we're listening, where could we stand beside you and be helpful? But it's also conversations about, we think this is a problem. Are we right? And if so, what would you want us to advocate for if we went to visit with this commissioner or this superintendent or this council person as issues of reparations are decided? So there's part of what we're lifting up is, you know, concurrent with our own journey in addressing our needs to confront racism in our lives and in our past, is the opportunity to practice the work of anti-racism right now, and to be a source of difference and to work toward greater racial justice where we live. And I hope that wherever you are as you're watching this Zoom, you're thinking about ways your congregation and the members of it bring skills and relationships that they can leverage to be a source of anti-racism difference where you live. So I'm not trying to be Pollyannish. I'm trying to be challenging, I suppose, and honest about this is a journey with many trajectories that will go on directly. Our own journey about how do we learn, how do we get in this mess? How do we participate in it? And how can we begin to be the change, as Gandhi would say, to be the change we want to see in the world? Maybe that's a good way, a few minutes after 8, Jamie, and Shannon, for us to bring this particular presentation to an end, and to remind you to watch for the February 6th opportunity to meet with Professor Erskine Clark, who has tremendous expertise about the life of the church in the context of slavery and in the civil rights movement. Thank you a lot for being a part of this first meeting.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you,
All right,
Nancy,
everybody.
very much.
And there was a question about where this will be posted on on our FPCA website as a recorded Zoom.
Awesome.
Yep.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.